Bio Bros, episode 13. This one, we're going to be talking about wild caught versus captive bred. We're going to go into a few different kinds of versions of it because it's not a cut and dry issue. It's not, yes, captive bred is better every single time. It's not wild caught is bad or any other way. There's lots of different things to go into, and it's fairly opinion based, so it's going to be kind of another chill discussing one. Alex has done a lot of research into this and has some opinions on it too, so that'll be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I definitely have some pretty strong opinions when it comes to this. Um, I was telling Shaw before the show that I actually in high school did a whole research paper on wild caught versus captive bred.
Right. So we'll get right into it with reptiles because I feel like reptiles are the one that causes the most controversy. Uh,
Mhm.
with fish, we'll get into that later. People don't talk about it. Reptiles, it's talked about all the time, and it's usually fairly apparent that you can tell. So pros and cons of each, in my opinion, first, and I'll turn it over to Alex. So captive bred, very, very little risk of disease, easily track genetics and all of that with them. You can usually get younger animals. They're captive bred, pretty solid. You're usually off to a nice start. They usually tend to have better temperaments too, because they've been raised with humans, so they don't associate humans with bad memories of being kidnapped from their homes. And then wild caught usually are really cheap. Sometimes it's the only way you can get some species. Some of them have not been bred in captivity or are not readily available in captivity yet, and so there's some good options there. But cons of wild caught is lots of diseases and bad attitudes, and then potential ecological damage. You're removing an animal from the ecosystem. As far as the ecosystem's concerned, it's the exact same as going in and killing the animal. It's still not providing its role in that ecosystem. So that can pose some issues as well.
Yeah, I think you basically hit it essentially on the nail. With like the captive bred versus wild caught with pros and cons. A couple others too is like with captive bred, um, you don't have to instantly medicate and um, rush it to the vet as soon as you get these animals. You don't have to uh, you don't have to like deal with an animal who would only eat the frogs or whatever is in its environment. They're more likely to be eating mice or eating prepared diets or insects like crickets and dubia roaches and things like that. Or like with crested geckos or other geckos, they eat fruit stuff like rapashi or Pangea. Um, while wild caught, you are more likely to run into an animal that has never seen that kind of thing in their life. Like a good example is hog noses. Eastern hog noses, you really don't see them in the hobby because they're if you do see them in the hobby, they're almost always wild caught. And hog noses eat majority amphibians, and in captivity, that's really hard to replicate. They've gotten better in the recent years with like reptilinks and things like that, but it's still this wild caught animal's not going to look at the reptilinks, which look like a little sausage, and go, "Oh, that's a frog." They're going to be like, "Why? I smell a frog, but I don't see a frog," and they won't. They might eat it, they might not. They're a lot less likely to, so it's a lot harder to get them feeding. Um, Wild caught, you have to take them if you purchase a wild caught animal. I'm sure Shaw and I both recommend um, instantly go to the vet, get it checked out, check for parasites, check for internal and external parasites, check for diseases and other things, because that's a good way to not only lose an animal very quickly, is because wild caught animals tend to have a lot of parasites. It's also a good way to kill an entire collection if you don't, because and also quarantine animals. Um, that goes for captive bred or wild caught, to be honest, because you don't know the history behind these animals, but more specifically, or more so wild caught than captive bred. Like captive bred, I would maybe quarantine 3-4 weeks and then maybe go from there. Wild caught, I would do 3 or 4 months or more because they are normally riddled with parasites. Um, and they can even have parasites and stuff that can go from them to you. So it's another thing you gotta be really careful of. The attitude as well. And a good example of that is tokays. Tokays are known for being not very nice animals. But the more and more they're being bred in captivity, the more and more we're getting people who are having animals that are more used to and tolerate handling versus the wild caught animal who will try and rip your thumb off.
Yeah, like the Tokays, they really got a bad rap, I think. Now they're not the ultra nicest lizard in the world. I don't think anybody's gonna argue that. But they got a bad rap for being insanely nasty, and they're really not. They're just all wild caught. And something else I was gonna touch on too is like kind of a bit of an analogy. So how back in the day when colonialization and stuff was going on from Europe into the Americas, disease killed a lot of native people.
Mhm.
And the same thing, the native peoples of the Americas gave a lot of diseases to the Europeans, right? From all that traveling, vaccines weren't around and stuff. We're not vaccinating our lizards, right? There's none of that around. So you bring a lizard from Brazil, you bring that into America, and you have your Australian bearded dragon that they don't have the same immune systems. There is a high chance that that South American animal does not have any visible diseases at all because it's just used to that. And then your Australian species is has a big issue with that. It's actually an issue that's going on in the wild around where I live with rattlesnakes right now. Diseases are going around that originated from captive bred animals that the rattlesnakes here can't deal with. So it's actually a
Mhm.
big killer, and you really got to quarantine on that one. And reptiles can be tricky to quarantine because they are not very good at showing when they don't feel good.
Yeah, reptiles in general don't tend to be very good at showing when they're not feeling well or under the weather. A lot of times they decline very quickly, or it's very little over time, and then all of a sudden they just drop off a cliff. Um, they're because that's how they are in the wild. They have to be in the wild because if they show sign of weakness, they are not very high on the food chain normally, so they're very quick to get eaten. So they just have to try and hide it so that no one knows and nothing can tell that they are not feeling well and possible easy prey. Um, yeah, they. It's another thing too is like with you always want to make sure. And again, I'm harping on it, but quarantining. It's you gotta quarantine. You gotta quarantine because there's diseases in these hobby that will go through an entire collection. Like I know a big one with colubrid snakes is crypto, and it's a very hard disease to get rid of, and it can wipe out an entire collection of colubrid snakes.
You know, it's quarantine is a if you're dealing with wild caught quarantine, it's is in your best interest. But we'll move on to fish a little bit. So still basically all the same themes apply throughout all of this through wild caught and captive bred. Pretty much the major themes are about the same. Fish get a little bit tricky because not all fish are equal in how they're collected or how they bounce back from collection and all that kind of stuff. So we'll get into that a bit. So, for instance, saltwater fish. Wild caught saltwater fish, more and more is coming out about that industry, and the actual workings of it versus how they say it's working are a little different. And a lot of the practices are quite unethical. Cyanide fishing, that's been around for a long time, and a while back they said they weren't really doing it anymore, and turns out they never stopped doing it. And so they're what they do is they take cyanide, divers go down and they poison the fish in a area and basically works like anesthesia. And then they just scoop up these just sedated fish, and it's really easy to catch. Because if anyone's ever kept a reef tank, go try to catch a fish out of there. It is a disaster. Everyone, it's the worst. Terrible. So you kind of have to somehow make it easier. And that cyanide is a way to do it, really pollutes the reef, and is actually, turns out, a big reason why some saltwater fish were deemed as very sensitive. and didn't ship well. It's because they were poisoned. It just took a while for them to die. So their failure to thrive in captivity was because they were already dying. If you left them in the wild, they would have died anyway. So cyanide fishing, not very good in saltwater. But switch it over into a less unethical version of it is like in South America. It's a lot of dudes that just dip nets. So they wade out into the water and they scoop up some fish and then they pick out the ones that they're going to keep and not. And so very little damage to the fish and they get to be very selective about who gets back in the wild with no damage and who gets taken to be sold. So they can determine size a lot better, species a lot better, and generally fish collected from South America do very, very well in captivity because of all that.
Yeah, fish are a whole another ball game. Um, but there's also fish. It's less like, oh my god, it's wild caught, I shouldn't buy it, versus like reptiles, because fish, there's some species that we can't breed in captivity, um, or it's just very select few people can breed them in captivity because they need very specific things, or they just need a absolutely massive enclosure that no normal everyday Joe can provide. Um, so some species they have to be collected. There's no other way to do it. Um, Now some species though, like your commons, a lot of species, if they you can breed them in captivity, especially if they're deemed like easy breeders, don't buy wild caught. There's no point to it. Like angelfish. Um, there's really no point in buying wild caught angelfish, other than I guess getting the like wild colors and wild what like shapes and stuff because they're slightly different than the domesticated ones. But at the same time, there's really no point. They're so easily to breed in captivity. Same with like other cichlids and stuff that are really easy, like jewel cichlids and things like that. They're super easy to breed.
Yeah, I will say though, I do love wild angelfish. Some of my favorite fish I've ever kept are wild angelfish, actually. But still with South America, there's actually seasonal fish in South America. When you hear seasonal fish, people tend to think of the killifish, where
Hmm.
they literally dry up and the eggs dry up and then they come back. But cardinal tetras are actually seasonal fish as well. They have mass die-offs during the floods, like the whole flooding cycle. They have mass die-offs and very few
Hmm.
survive. And so it's actually not a huge deal to catch them pretty much before they die. And then they get to actually live out a longer life in captivity, and the population actually doesn't change that much. There's been some studies done on it and some just anecdotal observations by people who we trust, and they've noticed it's actually pretty fun. Now, obviously, if we took every single one, it would be a problem, but they're not doing that. They're actually being pretty responsible, and it's providing jobs to a lot of people who live out in those jungle areas who have very limited options for jobs, and it forces them to care about and protect the rainforest because they need a healthy rainforest to be able to support their job of catching cardinal tetras. So, cardinal tetras, pretty much everyone you see is wild caught, and it's not really that big of a deal. Now, some fish, like the red-tailed black sharks, everyone's seen those in fish stores before. They are functionally extinct in the wild because of overfishing for pet trade. They're not used as a food fish or anything. They got overfished and you can't find them anymore. So you do have to be a little picky on species. Some species are more acceptable to be wild caught, some are not, and that's kind of on. You kind of have to do a little bit of your own research. But pretty much every freshwater fish you see is captive bred. It's freshwater fish tend to be pretty easy to breed, so usually they're captive bred for the most part.
Yeah, really, freshwater fish, the only ones that really aren't captive bred sometimes are like some of the obscure freshwater fish, like the toothpick fish or crocodile fish, or what they're called or whatever, where they're really, really tiny little fish. And even those are still bred in captivity. There's just not as much. Um, and then some tetras and things like that. They're just not really bred in captivity because they're harder to breed in captivity. Um,
Yeah, same thing like
so
pea puffers. Pea puffers are only from one lake, and so those are something I am a bit concerned with, is those pea puffers only come from one lake, and they're amazing fish. They're super cool, I have kept them, and so I do fear overfishing could be an issue, but people are figuring out how to breed them. And more people are breeding them, so
yeah,
here's the thing to watch out for.
puffers in general tend to be mostly wild caught. More people are figuring out how to breed them, but they are one of those fish that's very hard to breed in captivity.
Yeah, so fish breeding, summary of that, well, fish wild caught versus captive bred is freshwater, usually it'll say wild because it's they might be a little different or breeders want different genetics. So normally they'll say wild because they want that distinction on there. Um, Saltwater, a lot of the stuff is wild caught. More and more and more is being bred though in captivity. And saltwater is a little iffy. It's kind of I don't know. I don't know how much I'm agreeing with it. As things are changing, the less I agree with it as time goes on. But I'm not gonna say it's totally evil. Just because a lot of people do it wrong does not mean everyone does. And freshwater fish, basically everything's gonna be captive bred, so you get all the same benefits of captive bred, less parasites and all that stuff. And wild caught tends to actually be a little more ethical just based on how freshwater fish function versus how saltwater fish function. That's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
Right, and then things I don't really know about too much, but worth it worth discussing what I do know is birds and mammals. I'm not really into birds and mammals. Not that I dislike them, it's just not something that's really crossed my path, really. I'm allergic to birds. I found that one out the hard way, working at a pet store for a bit. But so birds in my house, not a great idea. And mammals, only a couple really are ultra interesting to me and I really want to keep. So I haven't really done that. But birds wild caught, I know is usually a disaster.
Yes.
They're so intelligent and they're so like mobile. Their native range is huge. So when you
Mhm.
take them out of somewhere and plop them in somewhere completely different, it tends to just be a complete disaster and a meltdown. Things do not go well.
Yeah, they that and also they tend to just like have more problems with themselves, like especially like my cause. Then they'll start plucking their feathers and all that kind of stuff because they have psychological problems because it's like what is happening. And I feel as though birds are less have like less and less as the years have gone on been wild caught um, because of like things like that, and they just aren't viable as wild caught. Um,
Yeah, and poaching became a very large issue with birds. I forget what
yes.
species. I read a book and Heiko Blair was talking about a specific type of bird in South America, and it became a hot commodity in like the 70s, I believe. And
Mhm.
they're really, really cool over in Europe, I believe it was. Yeah, specifics don't matter on this one. They became really cool, and so the hunters came down and they wiped them out, and now they're critically endangered.
Well,
So
another
bird
great
collection got really locked down. People do not it's hard to collect birds now legally.
Yeah, I mean, a great example of like it's similar to yours is here in the Carolinas. There was a parakeet. It was called the Carolina parakeet, and people liked feathers for fashion. They liked them as pets. They hunted them into extinction. There is no Carolina parakeets anywhere in the world anymore. All because people wanted them as pets or wanted their feathers for fashion and things like that. Um,
Yeah,
now
birds are
I will.
quite sensitive.
Yeah, and when it comes to like mammals, really, from what I understand, there's really not cap or not wild caught mammals anymore. And like the pet trade and stuff, like all the hamsters you see, all the mice you see, all the rats you see, rabbits, the chinchillas, all that stuff, they're all captive bred now. Um, the only things you might run into that'd be like possibly being wild caught would be like the really exotic stuff like tigers and which that no. um, people shouldn't even own those in general. I don't think any private individual should own a big cat really. Um, but like foxes and stuff maybe, but really that not many people are like big into those. But
Yeah, I think
again,
if you're getting a wild caught mammal, you're pretty deep into it,
and you're
and
trying. You're trying.
you're gonna be pretty educated on it. Like it's gonna be a bit of an ordeal. You're gonna be looking for something really obscure and uncommon, and you're gonna be talking like directly to these people who are worked with the importers directly. Like, it's not gonna be a big middleman process to
No,
get a wild caught mammal. It's gonna be pretty. You're gonna know.
yeah, no, they are not a. They used to be obviously, but they nowadays wild caught mammals are like almost non-existent. Those aren't a thing in the pet trade really.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason the term breeds like rabbits exists
Yeah,
because
because they
mammals
breed like
tend to,
crazy.
mammals tend to be good parents. They tend to have really high success rates with their babies. So,
They tend to be
poultry,
really easy to breed in captivity.
yeah. So, mammals, I don't know about those. So, we'll get into just a little general discussion now. So, Alex, what would you get most of if you're actually no here? We'll do it this way. There's a species, and it's fairly difficult to breed, but you're fairly experienced with reptiles too. The only way you can get it is wild caught. How are you gonna go about it? You really like this species. It's not necessarily bucket list, but it's super cool and you would enjoy it. Only way you can get it though is wild caught. What are you thinking about?
So if I had like the like knowledge and everything, knew how to care for them, knew how to what they would eat, and what I'd have alternatives, food sources that I have actually researched and found already before getting the animal and stuff, I would do it to breed them to get them in captivity and have them captive bred. Um, it's not something that everybody should do. It is not something that anyone who doesn't know about the animal or doesn't have a complete passion for that specific species should do. Um, like I guess a good example of what I would. Well, it's not a great example, but it is an example of something that I would like to keep. That's not like a super crazy um, bucket list animal or anything like that, but you can only ever find them wild caught. Really, it's very rare to find a captive bred. Or we were talking about before the show, savanna monitors. And a lot of times it's because when they are captive bred, they're more expensive and you can buy any of them for like 20 bucks. So, but that is a species that I think there needs to be more captive breeding. Yes, it's not a big ticket animal, but at the same time, the amount that we are just robbing of the wild of is insane. Because you'll go to reptile shows and there's over 100 at almost every single show, and every single one of them is from the wild, riddled with diseases and all other things.
Yeah, so the reason I kind of posed that question, how I did, was because I am in a similar situation. So I want to get another snake. My snake passed away a few months ago, and I think I want another snake. I enjoy them, and specifically, I want something that is going to be fairly similar in body shape, and behaviors to a rattlesnake. That way, I can get some reps pretending as if it's a venomous snake, and then when I mess up, I don't die when I do eventually take the leap into keeping venomous snakes. And my options are I've kind of narrowed down of things that'll be good for me is the classic hognose snake. They actually feel quite a bit like rattlesnakes, a little thicker bodied, and can be picky to eat sometimes too. That reptile diet, and they're they're neat little snakes to have. My other option is a viper boa. So the issue I have with the viper boa is so many of them are wild caught, and the captive bred ones are very expensive if you can find them.
Mhm.
And what's making me not just be like, I'll just get a viper boa is the wild caught thing. I have no intention on breeding this snake. I don't intend on getting a pair. I don't intend on breeding. Even if I get a hog nose, doesn't matter. I don't want to be a snake breeder. I want a snake that I can enjoy and help me build some useful skills. And so I don't think it would be good for me to buy a wild caught animal and not intend on breeding it, especially something like a viper boa. That's an awesome snake and would totally be a super cool snake to have in the reptile hobby as a captive bred animal. They look exactly like vipers, but they're totally harmless. It's super cool. So I don't think I would get a wild caught viper boa just because it's wild caught, and I don't feel like removing an animal from the ecosystem for my enjoyment without bettering the world in some way.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree that no, in my opinion, no one should really buy an animal that is wild caught unless they're planning on breeding it to put it into the back into the hobby as captive bred babies. And that's just me, in my belief, because I just feel like if you're not, then you're just wasting animal that was stolen from the environment, and it's just there's you have no argument as to why you did it then, and it's just bad to me. um is again my opinion. I just don't. I'm not a big fan of wild caught in general. But I do understand that, like with some species, it has to happen because there's no way we will have them in the hobby unless you do start with wild caught. Um, but I feel like there's way too much or way too many wild caught species in these hobbies already. So I just feel like if unless you're going to breed this a species, you should not be buying wild caught.
Yeah, I'm kind of of the same opinion, especially with reptiles,
Yeah,
where reptiles take a long time to breed, usually like multiple years. A lot of fish can be mature in just a couple months and breed, so collection isn't as big of a
detrimental.
like hit on the ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like Russian tortoises, there's a reason you only ever see adult Russian tortoises in stores,
Hmm.
right? I think people are really raising up a tortoise for that many years because tortoises grow slow. That's the ones you see in stores are like at least 5 years old. They've been and up to maybe 50.
Yeah, and I mean, because there's like I think it's Petco now. Yeah, Petco. They sell Russian tourists or Hermans, and they're like not babies. They're like good like 5 to 6 inch shells, if not bigger. I mean, that's a easily 10-year-old tortoise, and
That's
I
a
know
breeding
Petco
age.
ain't raising that.
No. And so where'd that come from? Actually, Russian tortoises, most of them come from Kazakhstan. There's a few different localities, but most of the ones you see at the stores are from Kazakhstan. And there's a few indicators to tell how where they're from, but that's not this episode. And I don't know how much longer we're gonna have a population of Russian tortoises in Kazakhstan, just
Mhm.
because of they obviously have very loose collection laws, and unfortunately, there's a lot of political turmoil in that area of the world, and so they don't necessarily have time to be worrying about tortoises. They're trying to worry about not having wars and things happen. And they're collecting these tortoises that take years and years to mature and breed just by the truckloads of them. So, especially like tortoises and any sort of chelonians or shelled reptiles, you gotta be working to breed them if you're getting a wild caught one. Unless
Yeah,
it's a rescue. Like, if you find one that needs a home, you can totally give it a home. Who cares where it came from? All that matters now is that it needs somewhere to live. But going out and buying one at the store is different than taking in a rescue. And, like, especially some of those long-lived ones, it's hard on them. Birds are the same way too, like, macaws and parrots can live so long, it takes them a long time to mature and reproduce, so everyone you take out of the ecosystem is actually a pretty big hit.
yeah. I mean, it's like if everyone wanted a Aldabra or um, Galapagos tortoise, and they were taking them out of the wild. Those Galapagos tortoises aren't breeding age until like they're 50. And even then, I think that's a young breeder. And these are massive tortoises. That's why you don't see those. You do not. I know obviously those countries also have better protections and stuff, but you do not see wild caught like massive tortoises. Really, you see in the smaller ones like the sulcata, not sulcatas, the Russians and the Hermans and things like that. You'll see more of that, but like the large ones, you won't because if they did that, it would wipe out an entire species in just like that. Um, and it's just unless you're planning on breeding a wild caught animal, I don't believe that you should get a wild caught animal. And it's just it's not good for the hobby. It's not good for your collection. Because like I said, if you don't quarantine, if you're not super careful with this animal, super careful with after touching a wild caught animal, going and washing your hands and stuff before you even go into the other room, taking them to the vet, getting them checked out and stuff, you can easily wipe out your entire collection.
Yeah,
So,
and some of those original collections of like the giant tortoises are still around, or the
yeah,
F1. So if you see F and then a number, that means generations from the wild. So F1 would be their parents were from the wild, F2 would be their grandparents were from the wild. That kind of stuff are still kicking. So like think about how long that is. Like Jonathan the tortoise,
hmm,
he's Aldabra. He's like ultra famous. Like I'm sure you've seen
oh, I'm
Jonathan
sure.
around. You didn't even know it was him. And he is 191 right now.
Yeah.
And like he's been breeding still. That
Oh
dude's
yeah.
been around for so long. The chances of the Aldabra tortoise hatchling that you got being related to Jonathan are surprisingly high.
Yeah,
So
I mean, and reptiles in general live a really long time that people don't even realize. Because I mean, alligators, they've have alligators that they find that are over 100 years old and still breeding,
yeah, I mean,
and
people
that's
think of
not
them as
something you think about living that long.
yeah, people think about reptiles as short-lived, unfortunately, because most people kill them. They're
Yeah.
not, especially like we're in a good age of information. Back in the day, there was not a lot of information, and this is a new recent thing. Like my turtle, very first reptile I ever had, he will be, let's see, like 16 years old, and she still lays eggs for me every year. I wish she wouldn't, because in all honesty, there's too many red ear sliders in the world. But I tell people that, and they're like, "Whoa, she's so old." You're like, "I can't believe it." And like, "Can she survive?" And I'm like, "Yeah, she's gonna she's gonna be in the retirement home with me.
Yeah.
Like, we're both gonna be old."
Oh
The
yeah. I mean,
the fun fact that I say is the turtles from the original Rocky movie, Sylvester Stallone still has.
hmm,
Like, he still has those turtles from when he was young doing boxing movies, and
yeah.
now he's an old dude, but he's still got those turtles, and they're just fine. You wouldn't even know they aged today.
No, I mean, like I have two female leopard geckos that were retired breeders, and they're both 15 years old. Uh, going on. No, they're both 14 years old. Sorry, but still, that's old for some people to think. Like if that was a dog, that's an old dog. If it was a cat, it's an old cat. But reptiles, I mean, they could be around here for another 10 years. They could be around for another 15 years. Um, there's the oldest recorded leopard gecko that was still breeding was 27. So, if kept right, reptiles are going to live a long time. And that's another reason to not buy wild caught because that animal maybe in the wild couldn't live as long, but that's still in captivity they might live 32 years. In the wild, he might have lived 22. That's still 22 years of breeding and stuff that got ripped out of the wild. And you
Yeah,
got to think about that.
even fish too. Like I was doing, I walked by my saltwater tank and I had my Royal Grama was in there, and I was like, "How old is this fish?" And I was just thinking, I was like, "I can't." I was like, "I know I didn't buy him when I moved into this house. I've been in this house for like 6 years now." So then I was like, "I didn't buy him then." So then I started looking back and trying to figure it out. He is bare minimum 10 years old, and this was a wild
Mhm.
caught fish. He was around from before they figured out how to breed Royal Grammas, and he's at least 10 years old, bare minimum. That's how old that fish is, because that was the oldest picture I could find with that fish in there, in the background of it. So, even that little 3-inch long fish is north of 10 years old. And I have goldfish too that are, I mean, obviously, goldfish are all captive bred. They don't even exist in the wild unless they're an invasive population. But I've had goldfish that I got, like, 2 months after I moved into this house, and we moved in here, like, 6 years ago, and they're
Mhm.
still kicking. So, animals are way longer lived than we think, just because a lot of the ones that we tend to associate with don't necessarily live terribly long. Like, it's kinda sad, but dogs and cats really don't live that long.
Yeah, mammals really don't live that long, unless you're getting to like monkeys. But even then, they don't compared to like reptiles and stuff. They don't live as long.
Yeah, it's pretty much like humans, primates, and then some of the big stuff, like,
Yeah,
uh,
like elephants
elephants.
and whales and stuff.
Yeah, but, yeah, like, dart frogs will outlive your dog. So,
Yeah,
that's that's the thing, like, wild caught, you do have to recognize that lifespan does matter a lot. If things are really long-lived, that impact to the natural environment in wild caught is a lot bigger. If they're short-lived, like those neon tetras that we talked about earlier, that impact isn't very big, and so, assuming you're taking proper quarantine precautions and stuff, a shorter-lived species isn't that big of a deal, really.
hmm
But long-lived stuff, it starts to get into that
if
ethical
you're
gray
not
area.
planning on breeding it, don't.
Yeah, and that's another general rule too. Captive bred, you should probably be working to captive breed them if they're wild caught, and if they're captive bred, you just keep it as a pet, who cares?
Yeah,
But even then, this is just our opinions on stuff. I don't If you have a different opinion, go for it, like, let us know in the comments, talk about it, like, I'm open to that kinda stuff. I know people who have wild caught animals, I've had wild caught animals, and I still
yeah.
do, like, I have that Grama that came from the wild.
I mean, I have wild caught animals right now too. I have two green tree frogs.
Yeah,
That
actually, all of my saltwater fish are wild caught,
yeah, I'm sure a lot of my fish are. Actually, no, I don't think any of my fish are. Now that I think about it, I don't know.
but yeah, so it's not necessarily evil. Like, some people really, like, demonize wild caught, and I don't think they're necessarily right on that one. There's lots of
It,
places doing some cool stuff that helps employ people to
yeah,
collect stuff, and they do education and things of they don't collect adults. They do that with in the Amazon a lot. The big fish, first of all, they don't ship very well because they're bigger, so they require more oxygen and they create more waste. So they don't ship very well. And also, they want those big breeder fish to be back in the water to breed and make more and more and more babies so they can catch those and then sell those ones. So they're actually protecting the Amazon by collecting fish out of it. Now, that is a
hmm
fine line because at what point do you go from taking just a little to taking too much?
yeah,
But it's not necessarily evil, right? But when people are using cyanide in reefs and mini spear fishing to get saltwater fish and then capturing reptiles that are 15 years old and can live another 60, that's probably not the best idea.
yeah.
So, anything else you want to tack on before we get this
Um,
episode wrapped up? I feel like we covered nearly everything.
yeah, I think we did. The only thing I would add is another thing to look out for when buying like reptiles, specifically, if it says farmed. I would not recommend getting a farmed animal. Because when they say farm, they mean they have these giant enclosures where they shove hundreds of the same species into these enclosures, and then once those animals breed and lay their eggs, they then take them and so they're and then they sell those. Um, they're basically all the negatives of wild caught, but add on they're more likely to be even more likely to be sick, or the animals you're getting are not more likely to be sick, but actually no, yeah, the animals you're getting are more likely to be sick as well because even once they hatch, they are just shoving them into massive enclosures with thousands of them. With them being so many together, stressed out, they're more likely to be sick. They're more likely to have genetic problems. They're more likely to have um, just poor health in general. So look out for farmed um, and wild caught slightly because you're not taking from the wild, but at the same time, it's more likely that animals can have a lot of health problems.
Yeah, farmed is usually not good, and there's actually a lot of illegal farming. In
Yes.
Florida, I know for sure this is 100% the case. What they'll do is they'll get a plot of land, and they'll just release a bunch of chameleons onto that land. And so now we've got invasive species issues we're dealing with too. And they just go catch chameleons out of there. When they find babies, they catch all those babies.
Mm-hmm.
So another issue with that of like, okay, let's say you don't care about the invasive species thing, you don't whatever. That's not a problem to you. Here's a problem where it will affect you. Florida is not where these species are coming from, right? A lot of this isn't just chameleons. Lots of different species are farmed this way in Florida specifically because the climate's pretty nice. Florida is not the same. It can be too hot, it can be too cold, too humid, all that kind of stuff. It's not where they're from. It's similar, but not all the way there. So if you get like a chameleon that was farmed out of Florida in the wintertime, and then you ship it and add on all that stress, that thing's going to have respiratory infections. I'd wager a large amount that it's gonna come in really, really sick. Because it's not supposed to be that cold, and then you're gonna add all this stress onto it, and then it's illegal too. Like they people will go to jail for releasing all those animals and stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
armed usually is bad. I'd I'm only reason I don't say always is because I'm sure there's some dude out there who has a pretty nice farm.
Yeah, the majority of the time, stay away.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything farmed that's ever looked good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to be proved wrong, but what I've seen, no good farmed. You don't want that. All right, so that concludes Bio Bros episode 13 for us. We will catch you on the next one next week here. That'll be another nerdier episode, kind of doing that alternating style where one's more opinions and one's more fact based.
Mhm.
So, hope you have a good day and see you next time.
Yep. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. Ding dong, not ding dong, ding that notification bell so you can get notified every week when we post these. Um, but yeah, and then also down in the comments, tell us some species that y'all know of or would like to see more captive bred in the hobby. Um, we really would like to know and stuff. Hope y'all have a good day, night, whenever you're listening to this.